I think we are ready to get started again here. It sounds loud enough. Everyone can hear me okay, I take it? All right, got the mic all figured out. So as Tanya said, I am Mark Ungerer, and I work for the state of Kansas. And I am going to give the next module, and that is on radiation fundamentals. So I do understand that giving a presentation on radiation fundamentals to a group of people like this is a bit redundant somewhat. You probably all have the knowledge contained within this presentation already. So just keep in mind that we're trying to make train the trainer, so that if we were giving this to somebody that didn't have that depth of knowledge about radiation, or was coming into it as a novice, or completely not knowledgeable at all about these concepts, what would be useful for them to know, right? And what would be useful to train that person that then go on and train other public health workers that don't do anything with radiation in their daily jobs. So we'll get started, and just keep that in mind for your feedback at the end of everything here. So the objectives. By the end, we're going to differentiate between the different types of radiation and the corresponding shielding and detection that it takes for each. It is unique. We're going to talk about the differences between exposure and contamination, and we're going to talk about that a lot. We're going to differentiate between dose and dose rate, talk about the radiation safety that can be used at the community reception center, talk a little bit about the biological effects of radiation, and then the different types of emergencies that would require something like a community reception center to be stood up, and the populations that might arrive depending on those emergencies. We'll start with the electromagnetic spectrum. So lots of different types of radiation. All radiation, either natural or man-made, is going to fall into the category of ionizing or non-ionizing. And you can see the very low energy non-ionizing radiation, radio waves, ultraviolet, things like that. We're not too concerned with that for the purposes of the CRC. We're going to be concerning ourselves with protection from that ionizing radiation. X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, those are all sources of ionizing radiation. So the different types. What different types of ionizing radiation are there? Well, there are four main categories that we're going to talk about. There's alpha, beta, and neutron particles, and those actually have, their particles have physical mass. Then gamma and X-rays are in the form of waves. So those will not carry actual physical mass, they're just going to be waves. And here's a comparison of kind of the shielding that you would use for each different type of radiation. Alpha particles are going to be the most easily shielded type. They're even blocked by a thin sheet of paper. The outer layer of dead skin cells, those will all block alpha radiation. So it is an internal hazard only, but it can be quite an internal hazard. So if you get the alpha radiation or alpha, any source of alpha radiation inside of you, it can actually pack quite a wallop to those soft tissues on the inside. So it's definitely a concern for contamination, especially if it's going to be ingested, inhaled, or anything like that. Beta particles, they travel a little farther. They are somewhat easily shielded. You can use, like a little bit thicker piece of plastic or something like that, about an inch or so. And they'll travel about 1 to 2 centimeters into the soft tissue. So they don't have quite the penetrating power to get completely through your body and give that dose to the organs, but high amounts of beta and high energy betas can be an external concern. Then you have gammas and X-rays, and unlike betas and alpha particles, those travel in waves and don't actually carry any mass, like I said before. And they have quite the penetrating power. So they can travel right through your body, giving dose to all your internal organs on the way. So gamma is a main concern with protecting ourselves from radiation sources as far as exposure is concerned, and that external hazard. Then you have neutrons, and we're not going to be too concerned with neutrons at a community reception center, but they are a particle. They can penetrate quite deeply into objects. They're most easily shielded by like feet of concrete or a hydrogenous material, such as plastic or even water you can use to shield those. Definitely an external hazard with neutrons, but at a community reception center, we would not anticipate there being any exposure to neutrons at all, where the reception center would be set up. So the difference between exposure and contamination. I said before, we're going to talk about this quite a bit. The next few slides are going to try and hammer this point home, so we're all very comfortable with these concepts here. Exposure is kind of the rate, it is the rate at which radiation dose is emitted. You can see the different units there, micro-R, milli-R, and R per hour. So with exposure, you're always going to have that unit over a period of time. And you'll hear R or rad intermixed with rem a lot of times. For the purposes of our teaching and response to a community reception center, rem and rad are about equal. There's some other math that goes into that, but for our purposes here, if you hear one rem or one rad, you can kind of assume that those are equal doses of radiation. Contamination is going to be uncontrolled or uncontained radioactive material. So the units we're going to talk about contamination with are going to be counts per minute or disintegrations per minute. It's radioactive material that is in an undesirable location. So here's some pictures of possible examples of contamination, or like in the case of this barrel, it's giving off a field of exposure here. A person who is exposed to radiation does not become radioactive. It's important to remember, if you're working at a community reception center, you may have people that are concerned that they will actually become radioactive through this exposure. It's important to reassure them that that will not be the case. Even if they are contaminated, most contamination can be removed with a variety of different methods. And we'll talk about some of those here. When you get an x-ray at a doctor's office, you leave, you're no longer radioactive. You don't carry that with you. It's sort of like going to the beach, and you might sit out in the sun for a little while. That sun exposes you to energy. It might even deposit energy into your tissues. It can result in a sunburn. But when you leave the beach or when you go home at night and turn off the lights, you're not going to give off that light. The light is not actually going to emanate from you at that point. It has just deposited its energy in your body. So that's kind of a rough overview, I don't know how easy that is to see for the folks in the back, but it's sort of an example, a graphic from the CDC about, radiation exposure. So you can see the source exposing the person to radiation. They're not becoming contaminated. They don't carry that radiation with them. And then comparing that to contamination. So various types of contamination that you can get. There's external contamination that could be in the air. You could have like a liquid or a solid or something like that that gets on you. It gets on your clothes, it gets on your skin, it gets in your hair. That material is on you. You're gonna walk around, you're gonna have that material on you. You might spread it around a little bit. It's external contamination. There's also internal contamination. So this type of contamination can happen. You might breathe something in. If you're in a radioactive plume, you breathe it in. You might then inhale that material and it will be inside of you. You could eat something that has contamination on it, or even just touching your face or your hands to your mouth or something like that become contaminated, and then it gets into your body. There's also the case where you could have like a wound where you get contamination on that wound, and then it becomes internal. It gets inside your body that way. So it's important to note, at the Community Reception Center, you're going to be primarily concerned with protecting yourself and others from radioactive contamination. Just because someone comes in that is contaminated, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have been exposed to a large dose of radiation. In fact, contamination at the CRC is not really expected to result in a dose that would be large enough to kind of have any outward effects, right? Any sort of effects on a person. We would anticipate any exposure dose to be extremely low. So how do we protect ourselves from exposure? We're going to want to minimize the amount of time that we are exposed. So you want to get out of that exposure field as quickly as possible. You want to increase the distance between yourself and whatever is putting out the field of radiation. So there'll be generally a source. You want to increase the distance between yourself and that source. And then finally, we want to put some shielding between us and that source. And I talked a little bit about the various types of shielding that can be used for the types of radiation before. In the graphic there, it's a big brick wall. Typically, we're going to be concerned with shielding ourselves from those gamma rays or neutrons rather than alphas and betas. So thick concrete, the denser the material, the better, typically. So lead, things like that. And here's some examples of units, the most typical units that you're gonna see. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the metric system, but you'll typically start talking about radiation in micro R. That's gonna be typical units for background radiation. It goes up 1,000 micro equals 1 milli, and then 1,000 of those would equal 1 R, or 1 rad. So just kind of a review of those conversions. If you weren't familiar before, you'll kind of hear them talked about interchangeably. And when we start talking about the biological effects of radiation and how much dose it takes, it's important to remember these conversions, as your dose is going to be much, much lower at a community reception center than what it would ever take to have those outward effects. So some key concepts, we talked about how that dose rate is always going to be a unit over a number of time, or a measure of time, right? So you think speedometer with that. You would have millirem per hour, like miles per hour, speedometer. So it's going to be the amount of radiation received over that time period. Whereas the dose is going to be the total amount of radiation received. That would be like your odometer. You might be traveling like 20 miles an hour, and then you end up going 200 total miles, right? It's the same thing with dose rate and dose. You have a certain measure over an hour, and then like 2 millirem per hour, for instance, and if you're there for 2 hours, you're gonna end up with a dose of 4 millirem overall. So kind of the difference is you might hear about exposure and a dose rate. That doesn't necessarily mean that is your total dose. You would have to factor in that time component of it as well. Another way to talk about it is, dose is the total force that you are hit with, and then dose rate is the size of the hammer, and time is how hard you swing it. So if you've got a small hammer, no matter how hard you're swinging it, the total dose is going to be low. Whereas if you have a large hammer and you swing it very hard, the force is going to be very large, and you're going to get quite a large dose. So everybody, all the time, is exposed to radiation. It's all around us. There are natural sources of it. There are man-made sources of it. It's in food, building materials, environments. There's a lot of sources, right? Just very low. Each day, Americans are exposed to about 1 to 2 millirem of radiation, and your expected dose from working at the CRC is going to be just a fraction of this average annual dose. So you can see it's about 620 millirem per year, or millirad per year that you're getting. Just typical day-to-day type of stuff. About half of that's from medical, half of it's from norm. Radon's a big part of that. And then if you're a smoker, that increases it, obviously because of the smoking aspect, right? Your dose at a community reception center would be expected to be like 100 millirem or less. It's rarely going to exceed that amount, so we're not even getting up to talking about where you would be exceeding what you normally get throughout the course of your daily life over the period of a year. So just important to note that the dose you would be expected to receive is going to be very low, and it's important to reassure anyone who's coming in to work at those reception centers they'll also be receiving a low dose, and it will be tracked. So they're not really in any danger of an acute exposure to radiation by working in these community reception centers. Now, the dose can vary from position to position. Obviously, if you're working at registration, you're probably not going to have as big of a dose as someone who's working in decontamination. But the dose overall would still be expected to be very low for any worker, regardless of position. We have some typical doses here, just from sources that people receive regularly. You can actually notice that the coal-burning power plant gives off a little more radiation than the nuclear power plant, and that's because of all the naturally occurring radioactive, like uranium and things like that in coal and oil. When it gets burned, it's then released and actually exposes people to that in the exhaust and ash, things like that. Whereas a nuclear power plant, ideally, everything's contained as it's producing, fissioning and producing radioactive material in the core there. It's not actually getting out to the public. And you can see even a coast-to-coast flight, some of you may have flown to get here today, it's gonna be a decent dose. Chest or dental x-ray, those medical procedures, is gonna give you a large dose at once, compared to other sources. That's one of the main things that'll kind of give you a larger dose all at one time. So now we move on to when you actually experience biological effects of an acute radiation dose. And you can see these are measured in rads. So we talked earlier microrad or millirad, and we are looking at a dose of about 100 millirad working at a community reception center, or even less. That's magnitudes lower than what you would get. You need 25 rad, and that's a tenth of a rad that you'd be getting. And that's just lab effects, right? So if you took blood work, you would notice a drop in the white blood cell count or things like that, but you're not gonna notice outward effects just looking at the person. They won't demonstrate any acute radiation sickness just from this type of dose. You would actually have to go in and do that kind of technical blood work and things like that. You get up into the 100, that's when you start to get the vomiting, diarrhea, things like that you may have seen in some of the more dramatic retellings of radiation incidents or something like that. It takes quite a high dose to actually meet that threshold. And then, it goes up from there. You can see there's body part at the bottom. So if you get a high dose to an isolated body part, you can have skin reddening and things like that at higher doses as well. We, in the radiation protection world, actually have a hard limit that you can be exposed to in any incident of 25 rad. So you're not allowed to exceed that amount unless it's for life-saving purposes, and you have to volunteer then to do that work as well. So rest assured that even someone responding to a CRC that doesn't normally do radiation protection would still be under these limits and guidelines, and oftentimes your local jurisdiction will have a much lower limit that any volunteer is going to be allowed to be exposed to before they turn back and have to quit their shift anyway. So you'll be very well protected working at the CRC from receiving any kind of high dose where you would have these observable effects. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about where these estimates of harm come from. So at very high doses, we know that radiation causes harm. You can see the woman there in the picture. She's using a fluoroscope, and just off the picture is the business end of an X-ray machine that's beaming towards her face there. So the beam hits the phosphors on the back of her little telescope there, and she can, as she moves her hand, she can watch the X-ray move and stuff, which is a lot of fun, except she's receiving a huge dose right to her face. So it was things like this and various other, throughout the previous century and into this century, people have been exposed to radiation. Some of it's through accident, others through pure ignorance, and then others like the atomic bomb survivors and medical patients have been exposed, intentionally, right? And we've collected data on these populations and tried to attempt to extrapolate the risk by measuring, what has happened to them. And at high doses of radiation, we've seen those acute effects, the burns, sicknesses, even death. Another observed effect of high doses is that you can have a marked increase in cancer incidence for those populations. So it's not, it's not like a sure thing and not a 100% chance that you're going to get cancer exposed to a high dose of radiation, but it's a slight increase over the natural incidence of exposure or for those people that were exposed. So you're going to have non-stochastic effects of exposure. Those are biological effects. They show a threshold and they increase with dose. And then you're going to have stochastic effects that have no threshold. The probability just increases with the dose that you get, but the severity is not going to. So, a higher amount of exposure doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a worse kind of cancer if you develop it. It just increases the chance that you could develop cancer in general. Now at low doses, we just kind of presume that radiation causes harm. So we use the linear no threshold model typically in radiation protection. And it's generally like 1 rem of dose increases your cancer risk by like 0.08%. The linear non-threshold model will postulate that there's just a linear increase. So if you have your 2-plot graph, it's just a diagonal 45-degree angle starting at 0, 0, and moving outward. Then there's the linear threshold model, and that would kind of curve up more like one of those quadratic functions that you see. It's lower at first, and then it curves up dramatically as the dose increases. The current risk per exposure ratios have been derived from a study of the atomic bomb survivors. And those survivors received hundreds of rem instantaneously, and then exposure from the fallout as well. So they had quite high doses, both short-term and long-term. And they've been studied, and that's how we get the idea that these large doses definitely cause the risk, right? Various bodies like the EPA have extrapolated those risk ratios all the way down to much lower dose levels. So that's where we get kind of the no threshold. They extrapolated it all the way down to 0 dose, and it's more of a hypothetical extrapolation, right? And in effect, it says that even the smallest amount of radiation exposure is going to increase your chance of getting cancer, even just a little bit. But there's not actually experimental evidence that proves that. It's kind of the accurate comparison would be like 100 people jumping off a 500-foot building, and you'd have some may perish and then some would have injuries and stuff. But if you take those same 100 people jumping off a 5-inch building, are any going to die or even be injured? Probably not, but the linear no threshold model predicts that that risk still exists, and therefore there would be a certain statistical percentage that would get injuries from that fall. And that's kind of the same sort of thing. It's not a definite thing, we haven't observed it at those low doses, but in the interest of being as conservative as possible in terms of radiation protection, we use the linear no threshold model to make sure that we're minimizing the dose that people would receive. We kind of go by the as low as reasonably achievable, right? So if you can minimize that dose or you can lower that dose and it's not going to cause further risk to health and safety or more risk to health and safety to do that, then try and minimize the dose. So as a worker at a community reception center, it is important to protect yourself. We talked about being exposed to large amounts of radiation or a large field is not going to be likely at these community reception centers, but you do want to protect yourself from becoming contaminated. You don't want to spread contamination or become contaminated yourself. And that's where personal protective equipment, you'll hear it referred to as PPE a lot, will come into play. So when you're dealing with a potentially contaminated individual, the proper donning of PPE is going to help you from becoming contaminated and spreading it around. It can be different depending on your position within the CRC, and it can vary depending on the type of radiation emergency that you're responding to. You might just wear gloves and booties. It might be that you have a full Tyvek with a hood and face cover and everything like that as well. So it can just vary. It will be determined just by the emergency and setting up of the CRC, who's responding there and things like that. All those things are kind of designed to protect you from contamination, both externally and internally, as would be the case, that full Tyvek suit or a face mask or something like that. Then once you're done with your shift at the CRC, you're going to be screened for contamination. So there'd be a doffing sequence. We'll talk about that a little bit here. And you'll get screened and make sure that you're not carrying any contamination with you outside of the area. So first, donning the PPE. You'd always do this in a clean area. At a CRC, there's going to be different areas. You're going to have your potentially contaminated side, and you'll have your definitely clean side, generally the area in between, right? So you'll always be donning PPE in an area where there's no contamination. You wouldn't want to put all your stuff on and then realize that it's all gunked up already, right? You're going to tape cuffs and seams as you need to. So typically, at the edge of your first pair of gloves, you tape those seams. And when you're putting on your booties, you tape those seams there as well. It prevents things from getting inside, prevents them from slipping off, just makes it a little more secure for your work, less to worry about. You're always going to have double gloves. So you have an inner pair of gloves, you tape those cuffs, outer pair of gloves. That's, you're going to be working with your hands a lot. People at the CRC are going to use their hands to screen people. If you accidentally touch someone who's contaminated, get your gloves contaminated, you can take off that outer layer and slip on a new clean outer layer of gloves without having gotten your hands contaminated. So always remember to get those double gloves on. And then doffing. So there will be a designated area at a CRC where you will be doffing the PPE. Typically, a best practice would be to have kind of a helper there with those doffing instructions listed out. They can just read them off one by one and have you do them as they're reading it off. You'll take off any dosimetry you're wearing. That'll be surveyed and bagged up. And your PPE will be disposed of in proper containers. They'll generally be labeled. So you dispose of your PPE in those labeled containers, say radioactive on them, and they'd be disposed of as potentially low-level radioactive waste. There'll be a sequence, like I said, it's helpful to have those written down. Follow that sequence so that you're performing proper contamination control. And when you're doffing, it's best to kind of doff rolling things inside out. So kind of turning your gloves, turning your boots, your Tyvek if you're wearing it, you would turn all that inside out as you're doffing. And that'll help from getting contamination spread all over the place or potentially contaminating more areas as you're doffing that PPE. And we do have a little pictorial, but I'm kind of afraid to open it up because I borked it so bad earlier. Let's see. It's not doing anything. Okay. It's a nice pictorial, and we'll include it maybe with the slides, but it kind of just goes through the process of donning and doffing. Nice little pictorial guide. It just goes through gloves and booties, but it gives a demonstration, of how to put everything on and stuff like that. All right, so now we're on to discussing types of incidents that would require setting up a CRC and the different populations that might come to the CRC as a result. The first is going to be a radiological dispersal device. Now, unlike a traditional nuclear bomb, this doesn't actually create a nuclear reaction in the explosion. Rather, it's intended to spread contamination, generally using some source of nuclear material. You would think that those different medical isotopes that they're using would be a target for this sort of thing. And they use a more traditional explosive method to then spread that radioactive material over a large area. So much more likely than something like a nuclear detonation, as it takes a lot less technical know-how and the material's a little more easy to come by than like special nuclear material or fissionable material. It's also something that's going to create a lot of contamination. So this is one of the more likely scenarios that we would set up a CRC for, aside from like a nuclear power plant incident. You can see the damage is going to be contained near the explosion. There's definitely going to be some evacuated people, displaced people. You're going to have, up to multiple blocks of that contamination. You'll have fatalities, typically just from the explosion or then the ensuing panic, perhaps. You're not going to have a lot of fatalities due to radiation exposure necessarily. It just depends on the type of device they used and what kind of radionuclides are in the air. Now the next one is going to be improvised nuclear device. So these numbers are based on 10 kilotons, and this would be a much larger incident, right? You would have a much larger area of impact from the initial blast. You would have much more high chances of getting people who actually have that acute radiation sickness, though not at the community reception center, they'd be taken care of elsewhere if that were the case. But you're gonna have a lot more of those radiation injuries to worry about, and more than likely a lot more people contaminated because that blast will shoot radionuclides up into the air, there'll be fallout, things like that. So that's gonna be a much larger response than the improvised, or the radiological dispersal device. All right, now Tanya kind of covered these things, talking about the Goiânia, Brazil exposure incident. And the reason it's kind of here is to talk about those deaths, the injuries, right? We had deaths and people who got acute radiation sickness from this event, and that was largely from ignorance about what they were handling. So she had said they broke open the source, they spread it on themselves. The little girl was even like eating a sandwich while she handled it, right? So there was a lot of sort of ignorance and then just obviously not handling it properly because they didn't realize how dangerous the material was. And that was why there were deaths associated with this case, right? We wouldn't expect from like a dispersal device you necessarily having that much acute radiation sickness, though it's certainly possible. And then the Fukushima event, this one, it's important to note that there weren't fatalities involved with radiation exposure or contamination from this event, but there were people who were injured or even killed during the evacuation process. So, in summary, we've made it to the end here with only one minor screw up there, right? So, these fundamentals are important to volunteers so they can protect themselves mainly. It's also going to be important so they can reassure people they have enough knowledge of health physics and of radiation exposure and contamination to reassure people that come into the community reception center as to their risk and be able to communicate that risk confidently, right? They have enough knowledge to be able to sort of do their position, protect themselves, and the people who come in that are potentially contaminated, both because they'll be obviously in a, probably not the best state of mind at the time, and because we're assuming that most people that respond to a community reception center are complete novices as it comes to, radiation protection and these sort of concepts of radiation. One of the most important things with the people at a community reception center is even if you get like a high counts per minute on your meter, even if you have a high level of contamination, it does not mean that you've been exposed to an extremely large dose. And so, if people are getting screened for that contamination, the meter just starts buzzing off the charts, or they hear hundreds of thousands in counts per minute or something like that, it might cause them to have some sort of a panic, because those are large numbers, right? So you can kind of reassure them that a lot of contamination does not mean a large dose, and we're doing what we can to protect themselves from getting high exposures. And that's all we got. Questions?
Yeah, so question on, so when you talk about being contaminated by radiation and any type of threshold, whether it be like nuclear glass, have a lot of contaminant in you, or you talk about just daily radiation, do humans build up any type of natural resistance or like immunity to any type of radiation? Do you know anything about that?
Well, so there are people that talk about like radiation hormesis, right? And how exposing yourself to like small doses can help to build up other resistances, but I'm not completely familiar with all that science. I don't think it's generally accepted as a common practice necessarily. But there are people out there, I know there are like radon spas and stuff like that in Europe that you can go to actually get exposed to radon, and they say it helps with a number of different things, but I don't know enough about that to be able to endorse it, that's for sure. I'm not. Yes?
Not so much a question as a comment about the presentation. It's always difficult, particularly when you're dealing with people that don't know about radiation, talking about LNT and, risk of radiation. And I guess what I would suggest, one of the things I've done is to kind of, if you go back to point out that, and some of us, work for regulators, so we have to, follow LNT because if you're, EPA, or if you're, the Bureau reports, even Bureau 7 states, LNT is what we are governed by. But the important point I think to make is that below 10 rad, roughly, have never been any observable health effects. And years ago, I think that piggyback on that, I remember listening to Bob Alexander when he was talking about the intensity of R20 made a really, I thought, impressive presentation. When we look at the statistical study that would have to be done, you mentioned about, the risk of like 1 gram of contracting cancer. Well, the reason that it's never been able to be proven one way or another whether there are actually any effects of the low thresholds is because of population size. It would be physically impossible to assemble enough people. So I don't know, you don't want to get too technical with the group, but maybe some of those points to put out.
Yeah, that was one of the things we're kind of doing. We don't want to get too far in the weeds, but those are good suggestions. So that's the type of thing that we're looking for with feedback and stuff, is helpful things that people think it might be, good to include for folks that don't have a lot of experience with it. So that's very excellent. Yeah.
I want to add to that, like the milling micro, because you got 2 M's running around there. A lot of times with the people who are not familiar with terminology, we'll ask them, not like, they can pronounce it, but for micro, but this is to say like you are.
Yeah.
So what's up to you? And it's you.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like, so we actually use that distinction because it's quite a, you don't want to, there's a difference between the micro and the milling.
Yeah, we get that a lot with like dealing with our scrapyard folks and stuff. They say you are a lot. So yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
General comment came from the Vermax side of the house, and I'm where basically where the samples come in, where they go out sample, find out where the boom's going, this, that, and the other, and the samples to the hotline. And we always get the public looking
Well-
may not be there.
I mean, I guess that's going to depend like on jurisdiction, I suppose. You know, we have a power plant in Kansas, so we drill with the DOE and have FERMAC in for our evaluated exercises and stuff like that. So hopefully, you know, by the point in the incident where you're standing up a CRC, hopefully they've called for those federal resources to come in and help them out. Now, I doubt they do much at the CRC, right? Like the DOE or those teams, the RAP teams or someone like that wouldn't be there, but yeah. Okay, I see. So it's just a matter of communication between agencies on where to go and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, people always want to, know what they're exposed to, they want to be analyzed right there on the spot. Because you're curious and want to.
Yeah. Yes.
I am brand new to all of this, so.
Oh, excellent.
Put that out there, but, so with the war in Ukraine and Chernobyl in the news again, I mean, are there a lot more questions coming in? I mean, you hear reports of Russian soldiers digging in the red zone and potential exposure and all of that. I'm just wondering if that, starts to factor into, just response, because I think, the general public, they kind of freak out by that, and any type of a radiation or a nuclear incident is going to be Chernobyl.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in Kansas anyway, we kind of communicated with other states and stuff and developed some messaging, right? And the IAEA put out some of that as well, some messaging that you can use. I didn't get any direct inquiries, but I know we had some to the governor's office just about, that people concerned that there could be some sort of a radiation disaster as a result of those activities. And, we just trying to reassure people that, about what was there, right? So people think Chernobyl, they think this huge disaster, but even like losing power and all that there wasn't the risk that you could have necessarily that type of event happen again. So there's public messaging and stuff that comes out as a result of things like that. And so we kind of have them like ready, responses and an update of the situation as much as we can get and stuff like that.
One point on that, as it pertains to Ukraine, we've had quite a few questions from the states and getting questions from the public, and we are pointing them to several sites from our website. There is a National Alliance for Radiation Readiness that is collecting information and referring them to that site, which is radiationready.org, which is an alliance of a lot of public health, radiation control, emergency response type organizations that have joined to provide information on that, on emergency preparedness and for radiological emergencies. Also, we're pointing them to the International Atomic Energy Agency's website, which is providing daily updates on the radiological, mainly about the reactors in Ukraine. And in the United States, the EPA has put out messages. Of course, we have monitors all over the country that if there was ever a release in the country, like during Fukushima, we would be able to detect any radiation coming into this country.
Well, I was just curious, we have a lot of American troops over there, not too far away. Actually, I was in Denmark when Chernobyl happened, so I remember not being able to eat dairy for, a period of weeks because we were worried about all that.
Anyone else?